Okay, good evening everybody. Thank you for the introduction, and I want to thank you all for having me and for attending this. A little bit of my educational history was stated, but a little bit of my personal interest in this topic started when I was in high school. When I finished my graduate degree in art history from LSU, through that degree I became very interested in the history of art and the Nazis. I studied art history, specifically late medieval and early Renaissance art, which is a lot of the art that was targeted as for collecting by the Nazis. I started reading some literature, including Mein Kampf, when I was in graduate school, and recently finished my second graduate degree from UNO. So now I'm teaching 6th grade world history, and really love presenting this topic. It's quite a change in audience, and y'all are spectacularly attentive so far, so thank you for that. So in this lecture, I want to explore this complex relationship between Nazis and art. There is so much to talk about with this, and a lot of this subject, a few of the things that we'll discuss seem a little bit illogical to the modern viewer, but I will quote a great scholar on the topic from Yale University in his observation of, I guess, a little bit of the insanity. And on that note, when I teach, when I lecture, I was an art history professor for 5 years at Austin Community College, and I always maintain my professional, objective observation and teaching. And anytime I've lectured on the Nazis, it becomes really difficult to not use language that I wouldn't use with other people. Sometimes it's hard to refrain from calling Hitler a monster. So I hope you'll forgive me if I drop my objectivity, if I include a little bit of subjectivism and my personal opinion in what otherwise I hope to be an objective lecture about the history of what happened with this. So first we have a photograph. I'll get out of his way. Here's Hitler in 1919. Adolf Hitler was a soldier in World War I. And this is where we start, because this is where a lot of the history of this begins. Not just with the youth of Hitler, which certainly comes to play with all of this, but specifically in this lecture I want to talk about the why, the what, the hows, or the through, and the when. So the why, the psychology of failure. And this starts with Hitler being a soldier in World War I when Germany loses. And a lot of this loss fuels his interest in developing the Third Reich, in making Germany the winner. And we'll talk about some other losses in his life, specifically with art, that inform his destruction of and collecting of fine art. Talk a little bit about the what, how he tried to purify not just the aesthetics in art, but the aesthetics of the human beings around him, how he really objectified these human beings in a way that he objectified art, that eventually came to a head with the final solution, with his problem of what to do with the Nazis. But we really see that in art, and so I won't be able to dive very deep or barely even mention the Holocaust, but we all know that that's the horrid backdrop of what went on. We'll talk about through painting, through sculpture, through architecture, through even typeface design. He tried to have this control of the aesthetic environment around him. Now, commenting on what I just said, that we won't really be able to get very deep into the Holocaust and a lot of other topics. This is an overview of a really complex, multifaceted topic. But you'll notice pretty obviously that left off through the people. I am mostly going to talk about visual art. I'll only briefly mention that he was interested in music with composers in opera like Wagner, who we would Americanize and spell or pronounce as Wagner, but through Wagner, with whom he was obsessed. So we're mostly focusing on the visual art in this lecture. And the when. We're looking at the early 1920s, after Hitler was no longer a soldier in World War I. Pretty shortly after this, his obsession began, when he was imprisoned in the early 1920s for treason, when he first started developing some of the propaganda and the visual culture of the National Socialist Party. And this started in the early 1920s. He published his infamous book, Mein Kampf, in 1925. And this is still going on today. We'll mention some of the cases of restitution, or the returning of paintings that were looted or stolen, but often they were coerced at a price much lower than the actual market value. So this is still, unfortunately, alive and well today, that there are many paintings that are still hidden, undiscovered, cases that are currently playing out in court for restitution of many of these objects. So I mentioned that Adolf Hitler had quite a chip in his shoulder from being part of the forces that lost World War I. Not only fighting as a soldier, but his proud nationalism, even though he was really from Austria. And another huge loss that I think so greatly informs this lecture is his failure to get into the Vienna Academy of Arts. He was denied acceptance, and these are some of his paintings. Now, being a middle school teacher, if one of my students came to me with this, right now I teach 6th grade, or even if I was teaching high school and one of my high school students came to me with this, I would tell them that they were doing a great job. You know, these are fine works of art. As a critic, though, they're not great. And we see that throughout Hitler's attempts at art, his attempts at architecture, there's a consensus amongst art professionals and other critics that he's not very good. He really lacks for cultural refinement. And again, these are great in some contexts, but we could also look at these and go, well, that would make a nice postcard. Maybe not something that you would see winning awards at a new exhibition or at a modern art exhibition. This is Egon Schiele. Egon Schiele was an Austrian artist. Side note, he's one of my personal favorites. And he was accepted into the Vienna Academy of Art the same year that Adolf Hitler was denied acceptance. Egon Schiele died right before he found major success. He died in the Spanish influenza epidemic in 1918. And here we have a comparison of Adolf Hitler's buildings with Egon Schiele's buildings. We can see they're drastically different. While Adolf Hitler is much more of a precise draftsman, that maybe we can automatically relate to some of the forced exertion of control that he had on his entire Reich. Egon Schiele is much more free with his form and much more expressive. And this caused a lot of anger with him, and we'll see this play out that with the art that he collected, he strove for art that mimicked his own, that was very precise, that was very realistic. And with the art that he tried to destroy, he didn't like uneven lines. He didn't like bizarre colors. He didn't like form that he saw ill-fitting to the reality that is around us. So I often wonder, philosophically, this connection, or what would have happened? What would the world be like? I pictured if Adolf had been accepted into the Vienna Academy of Arts, I picture this panel of people deciding whether or not he comes in, being completely oblivious to the fact that they were in some ways probably deciding the fate of the world for the last 80 years. So a philosophical question to think about, those little decisions, those people who looked at Hitler and said, nah, not him, had no idea of the gravity of their decision. So the brief mention that I'll make with the Holocaust is to compare these unusual, expressionistic, abstract forms that he disliked so much about modern art. He translated that same love for his, quote unquote, perfection to the people that he wanted to be part of his Reich. I often, just to make things simple, think about the perfect Aryan person in the Third Reich as being a Barbie or a Ken doll. And here is a photograph of someone being measured, actually measuring their facial features. Now, some of these exaggerated facial features mirror the facial features that we see in the artwork that he tried to destroy, the artwork that he deemed bad, in the same way that he deemed these people bad. And here he is observing these, quote, unquote, if I forget to do that, to use the quotes, I hope that y'all will understand that when I say these perfect people, I mean in his view, these perfect people in his view. So he sought to destroy people with the same ferocity that sought to destroy the art, to identify the other, to identify what was bad. And all of this goes along with this overall aesthetic vision that he had for every aspect of his Reich. Now the next few slides are some posters that were part of the Reich. Now I chose to use these because they do contain some abstraction of form, but they're not nearly as expressionistic as some of the work that we see from artists like Egon Schiele or another of his contemporaries that Hitler so loved to hate, Oskar Kokoschka. So here Hitler is building, and we see this perfect Aryan built chiseled jaw, and of course the swastika on the Nazi flag, which is the torch of their regime that we'll talk about a little bit more. A popular artist for Hitler was Ludwig Holbein, and he developed this style called Sackplakat, or the poster style. And again, I bring this in because it is abstracted in many ways. We do see, instead of photorealism, we do see in her face that it's formed from shadows. And does anybody notice the parallel with her body and the swastika? The way her arms and legs are splayed out, the pinwheel effect of this looks a lot like the swastika behind her. And this exhibits not only his love for his flag, his love for the Reich, his hatred of anyone who looked what he thought weird or different, and his focus on the perfect human body through physical fitness with men and women. And another one of Holbein's posters depicting the perfect Nazi soldier. And notice this text, because very different to the Times New Roman that I chose for this PowerPoint, we see the use of the fractor style that's based off black letter, based off early printing techniques that were first developed in Germany that are part of this national pride. Now, I thought about using another typeface that might be more correlated to this specific lecture, but I've had difficult experience sometimes with transferring PowerPoints to different mediums. You think you have your perfect font, and then the computer you plug into doesn't have that, and your spacing gets off. So we will talk about typeface, and if any of you are wondering why I would choose such a staid typeface, it has more to do with logistics than with aesthetic or historical relevance. And I want to compare again, because we looked at those photographs of the human face being measured in striving for this perfect nose, the perfect width of a nose. And while the three posters that we looked at, the Nazi propaganda, are in many ways abstracted or verge on abstraction of form, they're certainly not photorealistic, they are still drastically different from the expression that we see with artists like Egon Schiele. And this slide and the next juxtapose Egon Schiele, the artist, with his artwork. And we can see that he himself is assuming the poses. He's not just painting them, but when he poses with his paintings, he's assuming these gestural poses. He's assuming these extreme movements of form that are unnatural to the ways that we move in our daily lives. And we see some of the similarity in Holbein with the faces, how Egon Schiele uses shading to denote form, or big swaths of color rather than just shading to denote form, and his very gestured hands, similar to what he has in this self-portrait. And perhaps one of the most famous paintings that used form in such a way is Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Women of Avignon, which was the red light district. And so here he's painted prostitutes as though they're displayed in a store window. And like many artists did after him, mimicking from him, up here in the top right, we can see one of the masks. A lot of the artists that led into Cubism and the Surrealists thereafter used masks from the Iberian Peninsula and other cultures and transposed these onto his female figures. And so it was exactly the cultures, or maybe not exactly, but similar to the cultures from which a mask like this would have come, these indigenous cultures are the groups that Hitler sought to destroy as humans, and thus sought to destroy the artwork that depicted such figures. And this was painted in 1907, and I mentioned earlier that Egon Schiele died in 1918. A lot of these works were done around 1910. So these are all contemporary, although regionally much different. While Picasso was working in Spain and Paris, Egon Schiele was working in Austria. So here are some examples of Hitler's perfect art, with him and some of his colleagues and henchmen walking through the German art exhibit of 1937. Now, he was never able to realize his master museum that was intended to house this really magnificent collection that he had amassed, but he began to display these in his new chancellery. He developed this legend around the chancellery that it only took them 1 year to build, when in fact it took nearly 5. So he created this myth of greatness around his art and his architecture. A lot of the people who were associated with Hitler, a lot of his Reichsmen, were artists in many forms, were writers, were poets, were collectors, were lovers of opera, were lovers of fine culture. And it's, to many, amazing how these men who sought so much greatness in their art came to use the same means that they had strived for greatness with to destroy so many cultures and so many people, so much physical work, so much architecture, painting. A lot of his forms, especially with sculpture, mimic these perfect Olympians that he had dreamed up as being a feasible reality. At the same time that he was exhibiting this great German art, this was meant as an example. He was a great propagandist. And so this was his example of what great artwork should look like. So, as any great teacher knows, you give the example of what you want, and a great way to approach things is to give the example of what you do not want, which indeed is what Hitler did. Simultaneous with the great German art exhibit was Entarté Kunst, an art exhibit about degenerate art, where he very clearly labeled, well, this is what we love, and this is what we don't love. This is what we should destroy. The image on your right is by a Russian artist, El Lissitzky. And El Lissitzky did this at the very end of World War II, beat the whites with the red wedge, and this was a clear nod to the Bolshevism that was going on with the reds and the whites and the communists in Russia. Well, using this as an example of what not to do, Hitler took this and used it for one of the poster images advertising his Entarté Kunst, his degenerate art exhibit that I mentioned was running simultaneous to the great German art exhibit. One of the big differences here, though, is that unlike El Lissitzky, it looks like they took direct influence from it, and they did with the colors and the shapes, but the balance that we see in his actual poster is nowhere near the delicate balance, the ballet, if you will, of how El Lissitzky composed and arranged his forms. So they took something that they deemed to be bad, and in showing people that it was bad, made it bad. On here we also see that they're saying, well, Entarté Kunst, and that this is exhibiting artwork that is Bolshevik and Jewish. So they used Judaism as a negative title for anything that they didn't like. Well, I don't like that, I don't like the way it looks, therefore it must be Jewish, regardless of the actual cultural origins, in this case, the Russian artist El Lissitzky. And I did notice, if some of you have, that this says 1936. And I noticed this when I would teach about this poster at Austin Community College. I taught there from 2009 to 2014. And I've never been able to reconcile why this art exhibit occurred in 1937 and this poster says 1936. Perhaps afterwards, if there are any German speakers who can perfectly look at this and let me know why. That would be great. But I have researched it and I haven't found a reason for this discrepancy. So as part of this exhibit, this degenerate art, they hung the artwork in the gallery. We saw return to his Great German Art exhibit, and we see how this reflects in many ways what some of us think is the ideal museum. You have plenty of space around the objects to view them. You have plenty of time in between viewing objects to contemplate them. Some room, some space around you to have that mental space as well. And when they displayed the Entarte Kunst, when they displayed this degenerate art, they hung it in a way that made it look bad. In the same way that this poster mimicked Eliziski's work, but made it look bad. It was in a bad way. And here we also see how Kunst is in quotation marks. So they're saying like, oh, this art, it's not really art, it's this degenerate work made of traditional art supplies or art materials, but it's not actually art. And here's one of the more rare photographs of Hitler actually going through this artwork. So they targeted all sorts of modern art, including here we see Dada in the background, one of the art movements that came about in direct reaction to the destruction of World War I. That they said, well, everything is nonsensical anyway. Futurism, that was a direct result of World War I, Cubism, Surrealism, etc. Now, within the exhibit, I pointed out on one of the posters that they talk about that work being Bolshevik, they talk about the work being Jewish, and here are some other terms that they used to describe the art in the degenerate art exhibit. They called it tortured canvases, moral decay, morbid fantasies, and insane bunglers. All of this was written haphazardly on the walls, and we see that some of the paintings are even hung crooked. Some of the rectangular forms are displayed crooked intentionally, just to make it look bad. And we wonder if a viewer of this wouldn't have realized at the time the direct propaganda. Like, we know why you're hanging that painting crooked. We know that's not straight for a reason. And so through a lot of this, and through, I'm sure, many of your studies of Nazis, many of your readings, that one of our big questions is, why? And how did people not see it? Who could have controlled this? Who could have done something about it? Certainly people slowly started to recognize what was going on. How could you come to this exhibit and not realize the propaganda that was in your face? And we hope that our generations today have learned from this, certainly. And I'll bring your attention also to the sculpture on the far left as an example and a foil to the perfect, quotation marks, perfect forms that we see in the sculptures here. So those are good, and she is bad. She is the what not to do example. So let's talk just a little bit about typeface, as I have my captions in Times New Roman, which is a typeface I delight in. The top left is Deutschland typeface. One of the names for this is the Schatzstiefel grotesques, which means the jackboot grotesques, because they were said to look like the boots that German soldiers wore. Another name for this type of typeface is Fractor, and this was something that Hitler wanted to be used throughout the Reich. Luckily, he didn't get quite there, but he did, in the same way he sought to destroy Jews and other people that he deemed unfit. He wanted to destroy anything that was written in a traditional Latin-based text and tried to mandate that everything within the Reich use this typeface, this Fractor-based typeface, influenced by the history of Germany. And to the right is a page from a Gutenberg Bible. There are approximately, I say approximately, I think there are 5 Gutenberg Bibles in the United States. The closest one to us is in Austin, Texas, at the Harry Ransom Center. So if you ever get a chance to go there, I highly suggest it. It's open 7 days a week. And they also have the first photograph ever taken in France in 1826. So we can see a Gutenberg Bible today, relatively accessible to us. And Gutenberg Gutenberg originated his idea for the printing press and the printing of his first Bibles in the middle of the 15th century. And so, harking back to one of the, in my opinion, greatest contributions of German history to our modern world, the printing press, he embraced this typeface. Now, at the very beginning, I mentioned some of the inconsistencies and some of the illogical aspects that we see when it came to Hitler and art. And in 1941, Hitler actually turned back on his mandate that things within the Reich that were printed in traditional Latin typefaces be destroyed. And he said, whoa, whoa, if I'm going to have a 1,000-year Reich and it's going to be a worldwide regime, then we shouldn't do something that's specifically German. We should do something that all cultures can see and understand, something that embraces the entire world. And so he reneged on his initial destruction of Latin typefaces and actually turned around and mandated the use of German-based typefaces, or I'm sorry, mandated the use of Latin-based typefaces. So one of the books that I'll recommend to you at the end of this, I have a short bibliography. Stephen Eskelsen, who's a professor at Yale University, said this about Hitler's 1941 letter mandating Latin typefaces. Stephen Eskelsen said, while no scholar would attempt to explain Nazi policy in entirely rational human terms, the notion that black letter script represents a tradition of Jugendletter, literally Jewish letters, is an especially bizarre fabrication, even for a regime led by anti-Semitic monsters. So some of these things seem illogical, and they are, and that's the way a study of Nazi history goes. A lot of it just doesn't make sense to a rational mind trying to study history. A brief look at film as one of the visual arts that the Nazis sought to control. Leni Riefenstahl was hired by Hitler to create a propaganda film using footage from his famous Nuremberg rallies. She later admitted that she regretted doing this because it destroyed her career. Her association with the Nazis for creating this propaganda film was definitely to the detriment of her career. Later she found some success as a photographer, but her name is always synonymous with this film, The Triumph of the Will. And in fact, it is in many ways really good. It's similar in some ways to Citizen Kane, with the various angles and shots that she uses. For example, the one we have here where we have this worm's eye view of Hitler speaking at his podium that emphasizes the oratorical effects and how dramatic he was. And the worm's eye view makes him seem above us, makes him seem powerful, regardless of our position or maybe our actual height to the viewer. So she used a lot of great and innovative film techniques, but nonetheless her career collapsed because of her association with this. Another picture of the crowds, and the crowds seem to take second place to what seem to be the crowds or the lines, the infantry of the Nazi banner that we have here. Now, this symbol to us is perhaps synonymous with hatred, with evil. It has great origins, though, in Sanskrit, meaning good luck, good fortune. And in fact, there's a website called reclaimtheswastika.org. People are trying to remove the hatred associated with this symbol from what it's come to mean in Western cultures. Hitler was very involved in the creation of this flag, as he was with many of what might seem to us otherwise minor aspects of his regime. Today we might call Hitler a micromanager for his Reich, that he was obsessed with every last detail, with typefaces. With his German art exhibit that we previously looked at, he hired other people to curate it and then didn't like the works that they chose, and so took over the curation himself. He was very unwilling to relinquish any sort of power for details as small as the size of the swastika, the width of the legs of the swastika. And here is a short passage from Mein Kampf. This section where he discusses the flag and the creation of the flag is actually 4 pages of text where he goes on and emphasizes his own contribution far above the contributions of other people. And this book, Mein Kampf, was published in 1925, so this is nearly a decade before Hitler was, I was about to say rose to power, but before he was elected to power. And he says, well, the flag really intensely interested us in those days. In this passage, he also says, well, this is the torch of our regime. It burns brightly. And in fact, it almost, I mean, when I look at the Nazi flag, especially on the red background, it does seem like a torch. It does burn an image into the eye, so to speak. And we see how he obsesses over the specific, and he tells us about obsessing over the specific width of the lines of the swastika. Now you would think that someone who hopes to control a 1,000-year worldwide Reich would relinquish a little bit of control of the thickness of the width to a professional artist. But that was something that he wanted to maintain in control of his flag. And then Mein Kampf, he goes into detail about the colors, different people who contributed. A dentist contributed one design that he didn't like. And then he ends the passage with, and I only took a couple of short sections of this quote, or of these pages of text, but this very last line I'll especially call your attention to if you haven't gotten there yet. The victory of the idea of creative work, which is really what we're talking about overall in this lecture. The idea of this creative work, which as such always has been and always will be anti-Semitic. So we wonder if he's saying here, well, all the creative work, all of your artwork, really, art has always been anti-Semitic? In 1923, he sketched this standard, and then later had a metalsmith realize his standard, realize the design for this. And we see in 1923 how he's still approaching what ultimately becomes the traditional standard of the Reich. He also fancied himself an architect, even though, as I mentioned, most critics and art professionals consider any of Hitler's designs to be meh, okay. Here he is, toward the end of his life. He committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. He's observing the model of the new Linz that he wanted to create his majestic world capital from. He even had plans to maybe destroy Paris, but he said, no, Germany's going to be so great it's going to overshadow Paris anyway. We don't need to destroy Paris. And it included a model of the Führer Museum, where this original exhibit of the great German art was intended to be housed. He designed a lot of this himself. And within that museum, he ended up compiling 31 catalogs of artwork that had been stolen or otherwise had originally been collected by himself and his cohorts. This is a photograph. I worked at the World War II Museum for 3 years, and this is a photograph of one of my former colleagues, the curator, John Costa, who's actually mounting one of these exhibition catalogs. This was one of 31. It was on display at the World War II Museum about a decade ago. These photographs were taken in January 2010. And then it was returned to Germany. So I do want to remind y'all, I mentioned that one of the Gutenberg Bibles is in Austin, Texas, not too far away from us for us to be able to see, and that the World War II Museum has a plethora of artifacts from Nazi Germany, along with things from throughout the European theater and the Pacific theater as well. Now, even in what we might consider more run-a-day publications, rather than fine art that we put on white walls in grand museums, also the Nazis published Signal. And this was published in many languages throughout the world. And it is the direct propaganda that leaves out all of the nastiness and ugliness that the Nazis tried so hard to hide about what they were doing, and presents all of the best stuff. If you try to erase from your mind what we know about the horror of Nazism in World War II, and we look at what they have here, if we transpose American subtitles on this, we have this soldier. Well, this is what we're fighting for. This is what we're fighting for. Beautiful little girl. Things that make life worth living for us. And next to this page, it was a poor image, so I didn't include it. I got a better image off the internet of the painting. This painting that says, well, what we are and what we possess, what is indispensable and sacred to us. Things like this example of this traditional German painting, this nearly photorealistic, of multi-generational family of women praying in a church. They're very humble. They're very down to earth. In some ways, they're the opposite of the great German soldier or the great Aryan man that's presented to us. And we can see how, okay, well, this makes sense. The culture, the things that we want to have access to. For man's right to culture, and here is the symphony where I bring in again Hitler's obsession with and influence by Wagner, spelled Wagner. And then we'll wrap up with the stuff that brings us into modern day. Here's some photographs of the Mona Lisa. It's pretty rare to see her off of her wall in the Louvre, except for the time in 1911 she was stolen, and the time in the 60s when Jackie Kennedy kind of sweet-talked the French into loaning her to the United States. Well, by this time people knew Hitler was after the art. And so what did they do? They evacuated the Louvre. And one of a few of my favorite stories about this is that Mona Lisa was evacuated to a French chateau in the countryside. She was given her own ambulance and a curator to ride along with her. And legend has it that when she arrived at her destination and they opened the ambulance, the curator had passed out due to lack of oxygen. Was ultimately okay, and this is legend, but was ultimately okay, and of course Mona Lisa was fine. Also, Nike of Samothrace, this great Greek artwork, here was crated up by curators and historians and rolled down the grand staircase at the Louvre. Now, I have a better picture, or a better view, because this picture doesn't help us realize just how great this move was. A curator present wrote in The Rape of Europa, a book that I recommend, and there's a documentary of the same name, said that as this was being slowly rolled down this grand staircase, that it seemed as though everyone around was holding their breaths, that you could hear a pin drop. Everyone was terrified that she would fall. And we get a better idea of that when we look at, here's a modern view of Nike at the top of this grand staircase in the sculpture gallery at the Louvre in Paris. She looks strong. She's made of stone. She looks mighty. But in fact, she's delicate from her millennia of existence. And here is a photograph of the back of her wing, where we can see this structure, this holding her together. She was found in pieces and assembled. So not only were they scared she would fall and break, but then it would be like putting a puzzle back together and perhaps incurring even further damage than she had originally suffered from her millennia of existence. And then we can't have a talk about this without mentioning the monuments men and women. So they actually, of course, played a huge role in what we're talking about with the Nazis and art, but they only came around toward the end of the war. It took a while for them to get funding. There were independent curators and art professionals of all sorts who saw what was happening with artwork and tried to play their role to make amends, to repair the artwork, to find the artwork, to make lists of the artwork that they knew the Nazis were looting and the people who had originally owned it so that they could restitute it. The monuments men and women were about 350 professionals from about 14 nations, and they worked in the European theater, but they were also at work in Japan. They left Europe in 1951 and played a huge role in preserving a lot of these artifacts. Now, the movie, as a historian, you're always kind of scared to watch a big Hollywood film that has to do with the topic, bracing yourself for the historical inaccuracies. I enjoyed it very much. I thought it was a good film, and so I do recommend it, but it only scratches the surface of what happened throughout Europe, and this emphasis, the emphasis of this lecture has been on what happened in Europe, but some similar things happened in Japan for the monuments men and women to be there. So here are a few of the Monuments Men posing with some of their discovered art. The Merker salt mines were perhaps the most famous for being a depository to protect and to hoard work that the Nazis were taking. Can I get some of y'all to maybe shout out some of the names you see? Who's this guy? Omar Bradley, what about him? Patton. And good old Ike. I love the looks on these men's faces. After all they had been through in the war, after all the stress, that George Patton can still have the wonder of a child looking at what was discovered in the mines. And then the soldiers who originally found this work had a lot to do with helping to preserve it. I mean, they knew what they were coming across. They had heard the stories. And here is a photograph. One of these salt mines in Siegen was turned into the Golden Arrow Art Museum. And for those of you who may not see the old photograph very well, the Golden Arrow Art Museum restored paintings of the old masters, and it lists a number of their names. They found some of the work from Charlemagne that was at his Palatine Chapel in Aachen in Germany that was deposited here. Some original musical scores by Beethoven. And then finally, a nod to what's going on today with this. There are a lot of artworks that have been recovered, but the provenance of them is yet unknown. There are great databases. Some of these databases I've tried to have access to, but actually only official museum, in some cases, only official museum personnel can access them, because people are scared that if we give lists of the Nazi, or the work that is missing from the Nazis, that is a great fertile ground for forgers to come out and say, hey, I found your painting, when really they created it, and these are worth millions of dollars. So I mentioned that these problems started in the early 1920s, after Hitler served in World War I, and they continue up until today. So the Association of Art Museum Directors is also concerned about this, and they have to go through their due diligence, but they have to admit provenance research is difficult. And then to that we say, well, it's worth the due diligence. It's worth you researching all this. There are a lot of complex databases out there. And then finally, here is a quick list of some different titles that I recommend. A lot of you know that there are flyers out there that have my full name on it. My email address is just my name @gmail.com. And I'd be happy to tell you the authors or other information about where you can find some of these titles. So I thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you. Do you have any questions for anyone? Please wait for me. Bring the mic to you.
Thank you, Anna. I did meet Mr. Edsel, who wrote Monuments Men, when he presented at the World War II Museum, and of course we saw the movie, and I was very distressed at some of the things that were portrayed in it. But I went to Russia in 2012, I believe, and I saw all of the artwork that the Russians had hidden since World War II, and then after the 50 years had passed, suddenly discovered them, and they are in Moscow and St. Petersburg, room after room after room of all of these artworks. And I know I read in the Monuments Men that one of the things that the Monuments Men wanted to stop the Soviets from getting to Berlin first, because they would steal the artworks. My understanding is that a great deal of what I saw are those very artworks that the Russians took when they got to Berlin first. Is anything being done or said about this?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. I mentioned, a lot of my focus is on what's going on in Europe, and thank you for bringing up Russia, who were our friends turned foe during World War II, and they did, and we hope we can find the Amber Room, right? There is a communication problem. There are things being done about it. So Interpol has databases of stolen artwork, not just from World War II, but around the world. And there are a lot of things that are hidden in plain sight. There is I don't think it would be right to call it a problem, but certainly an issue with having the right art historians who can translate Russian and English and understand exactly what is possessed by museums around the world. Even recently in the United States, to bring up Austin again, because I taught art history there for 5 years, there was a small piece that was owned by the Blanton Museum of Art that's part of UT, and only recently did they discover that it was the face missing from an altarpiece, I believe it was in New York City. And so there are problems with things like that even within the United States, within museums. And we would hope that we're going to increase these databases, how thorough they are, have them translated appropriately so the right people can find them. That there's a lot of searching for a needle in a haystack, a lot of miscommunication. When I think about things like that, I'm ultimately glad that the artwork wasn't destroyed, and I hope that we can get to the point of restitution. And I hope that answers your question.
Because they've openly said, these were discovered in 1996.
Discovered, yes, discovered. Hidden in plain sight, we knew where they were.
So they're all there.
I can say that there are a lot of professionals who are deeply devoted to working on that. Who are. And especially, museums are now scared to own artwork or to buy artwork that was looted. There's been a lot of backlash to museums inappropriately acquiring things if they didn't do the right due diligence.
Albert Speer was Hitler's architect and later arms minister. And if you read his biography, he gets into the obsession of minutiae that you talk about. Because Linz, I think, was supposed to be named Germania, and he had the whole city, he had the entire city laid out. And he even had a track light over the top to follow the direction of the sun that he could move for the seasons. So he could look at different days and see how the shadows would be cast at the buildings. So the original buildings could be arranged accordingly. And he said he spent an obsessive amount of time, even in the middle of the war, going into this room and just sitting there and playing with the lights and the studying what Germania was supposed to be around. Second thing is the movie The Train, I think it was, with, I don't think who it was, the gymnast, I think. There's another film about the art that was taken. I think that movie came out in the 60s. Burt Lancaster, The Train, I believe it was. And a final comment, you talked about Hitler and art. Much the same thing happened, if I'm not mistaken. Fidel Castro tried to become a pitcher in New York and didn't make the team and went back to Cuba.
Yeah, the psychology of loss, of failure, and how people try to react from that. Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. I have never heard of that film, but I will watch it as soon as I can. I will, yeah. There's so much literature I'm working on getting through.
It's been over 75, 80 years since the end of the war. By now, most of the original owners, I have to assume, are dead. Even the first generation after them is dead. How long before we can say, okay, this work of art that belongs to a museum belongs to somebody? Mm-hmm. Do we have a time limit, or we can go 200 years and still fight for this?
Mm-hmm. In what I know about the topic, it's something that is so culturally sensitive to people that they aren't putting a time limit on it. That generations after have been claiming, or the niece of someone, in the case of a famous Egon Schiele painting, it's the niece of a prominent Vienna art gallery director who is calling for the return of her family's painting from Vienna, and that went through the courts in New York City for more than 10 years before it was finally resolved. So I do know of many cases of what we might consider pretty distant relatives calling for this work, and right now there's no specific statute of limitations because of the nature of it.
Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am. How did Hyman Chandler, who was head of the Waffen SS time, he was also putting out the Aryan myths and the mythology for the Nazis to follow. How much did he figure into using this art for his own ends?
He was definitely part of what Hitler was doing, and before the war even started, he considered himself a collector and a connoisseur. art. I know he had a lot to do with the creation of propaganda, but I'm sorry, I don't have a perfect, concise, tidy answer for your question, aside from he was involved. And in a lot of this, I just kind of generalized. It's like, well, this is what Hitler was doing, and just kind of lump all of, if I may call them his henchmen, into the same group of all of these guys did this together.
Anybody else? All right. Ms. DesOrmeaux, thank you so much.
And again, I want to thank y'all for having me. This is something that I really enjoy researching. I really enjoy sharing my knowledge with people. And so thank you very much for having me and for listening. And let's keep these stories going so that we don't forget, and so that we don't forget the lessons that come from them.
Give Ms. DesOrmeaux another hand, please. All right, ladies and gentlemen, just a couple reminders. If you took drinks or food in with you, please take your trash out with you. Sign up in the back if you'd like to. And we will see you next month, but be aware, Mardi Gras will delay it by a week, so it'll be March 11th. And Ms. Ina Fandrich will be with us, and she'll be talking about St. Bernard, not the parish, but the saint.
All right.
We'll look forward to seeing you then, and happy Mardi Gras.